Hi, Anthony and Bob Barker here, and today we're going to be going over how to make this built-in. So let's get started. So the idea from the built-in came in because we had this wall here and it just kind of creates this natural cubby. So I figured, we had a table before, but I didn't quite like it so much. So I figured this would be a nicer use of the space and it just kind of feels natural. So to get started, the first thing I did was kind of measure the space and where we're going to be putting it. The issue that I have is nothing in this house is kind of straight or level or anything really. So what I did is I took measurements from this corner to that corner, and then from the back corner to the back corner, and then also from the bottom in the front and the back to the other side. And lo and behold, all four measurements were different. So I had to take that into account when I'm making this, because it's going to have different squeeze points when you're doing it. And then the other thing that I actually ended up running into as well is this wall isn't quite straight. It kind of leans forward just a little bit, so that creates a little bit of issues. So that's something to definitely be aware of when you're planning to make this type of built-in. You can't just take one measurement and take that for granted that it's going to fit. You got to make sure you're covering all your different spots, and that way you can make things work. And these are the different options I presented to my wife, and then she chose the one on the top left, and we kind of went over the different sizing of it that she would prefer, and once she was happy with what we had, then I got started. So the first thing was making the different cabinet boxes, and what I decided to do was just to make it into threes. Since it's 10 feet long, it's just way too big to try to make it all in one and get it in there. It's just gonna be way too clunky for me to do by myself. So I decided to break it into three, and it would make it much more manageable. So after cutting the sides of the cabinet boxes, I put this dado groove straight through the middle of it, which is going to hold the fixed shelf. Then I put on a sacrificial fence and then made the rabbet in the bottom that I typically make on most of the cabinets that I make. It just kind of makes it sit nice on the bottom piece. So for here you can see the dado and then the rabbet. And I just had to repeat that 5 more times to get all the pieces I needed. And then next up was breaking down the support pieces, as well as the pieces that I'm going to use for the toe kick beneath the cabinets. And since I'm making 3 different cabinet boxes for this, and I'm going to be cutting it down to 2 different toe kicks, I got a lot of strips that I needed to make. So I did all the ones I could from the other scrap pieces, and I just got another big chunk and just ripped that down to get what I needed. Then after that I used my crosscut sled just to rip down some of the smaller pieces that I needed, just because it gets a little clunky ripping that on the table saw just with that dimension of the lumber. It just goes a lot nicer on the crosscut sled, so that's what I decided to do. And of course using the stop there just to make sure everything is an even size. And once we got that all made up, it's on to some sanding. And I wanted to do this before I put it all together. It just makes it a little bit easier. So we just kind of did a nice general sanding on all the parts. And one of the nice things is here is you don't have to be super careful about going through the veneer on this plywood, since I'm planning on painting it anyways. And I'm once again using those positioning squares to put this cabinet box together. And I did have to repeat this 3 times. And I'm just going to kind of breeze through this one, but if you want to see in a little bit more detail my steps on putting these together, I'll link a video in the top right that kind of goes over it a little bit more depth. One different part that I am doing here is, since this is going to be hidden, instead of clamping this till it dries, I just went ahead and just countersunk some screws in there to keep it in place until the glue dries and holds everything in place. And then I'll repeat that over on the other side as well. And I am using 3/4 inch plywood for these cabinet boxes. To be honest, you can get away with something a little bit thinner than that. But the price was pretty similar when I was going to get the wood for it. So I figured if it's about the same price, then why not just go with this? It'll be sturdy either way though. So the next part here was getting this shelf in place, and this is not going to be adjustable shelf, so that's why I did have those dado grooves in there. So I just kind of filled it up with glue. Of course, I got a little spill out that I cleaned up, and then I just get that in place and then screw it in just like I did with the bottom part, and then that thing will never move. Next up on the list is getting some pocket holes drilled out, and we're going to be doing this on all of the support pieces for the cabinets. And while I'm at it, I might as well do the pocket holes for the toe kicks as well. And I did break this toe kick up into 2 pieces, mainly because it's 10 feet long, so it was kind of really a big thing just to do in one. But I also didn't want to make it into too many pieces just because the ground's a little wonky, and I didn't want to make it too difficult to get everything nice and leveled up. So I felt like 2 was kind of the sweet spot for this one. And I wasn't too worried about how this came out because it's going to be hidden by the face frame and the trim once it's all installed. So this is really just to kind of keep everything at the height I want it and to keep it nice and level. So now with the supports, often I'll just kind of clamp these in place, but I was giving it a try just using these positioning squares, and it actually worked out pretty good. I just set them on top and got it adjusted where I needed it, and it held them in place so it didn't wander while I'm screwing in those pocket hole screws. So I put them on the front and the back, and then once I get those done, I put in the support piece in the very back, and this will be painted so you won't really notice this later as well. And then once I have that all done, then I just put some from the top support into the back support just to kind of make it a little bit more rigid. And then I put them all up on my bench and got it together so I can get my measurements right for the face frame. I didn't want to just assume it was exactly as I intended it to be because there's always little variations as you're making it, and you want to make sure you adjust for that. And since this was so long, I am making the top face frame pieces in one piece. So I couldn't actually do it in the normal part. I had to hang outside of my garage to make these cuts. So I ripped those down and I used the feather board just to kind of keep good pressure on it and make sure my cuts are nice and straight. And you can see the long workbench did definitely come in handy as a good outfeed table with these super long cuts. Once we had those done, I also needed to break down some of the inner pieces of the face frame and using my the stop block there on the miter station just to make sure everything is even with each other. And to get the pocket holes in, these are a little too long to use the regular pocket hole jig, so I just use this clamp-on one to get it, and it works out just fine too. So next up, I'm gluing it up, so I just get everything aligned the way I want it. I put a little glue on there and clamp it in place, and then just get the pocket holes. And then I repeat the same process for the bottom part of it. And the clamps were super important because you want to make sure it doesn't wander on you when you're doing it, because otherwise it's going to give you a weird lip on the front of the face frame, and you definitely don't want that. So after I got the main frame together, I just measured the inside just to make sure that my measurements are still exactly where I want them to be. And I kind of trimmed that down, and I snuck up on the cut to get those exactly, nice, good, snug fit. And so then I put it on the cabinet boxes just to double check, because like I said, you can have a little variation in your different cabinet boxes if you weren't 100% precise. So I wanted to make sure I accounted for that. So I put that on there and just kind of loosely marked where I needed those to be just to kind of give me a good idea. So luckily, my measurements were equal on both sides. So what I did is I cut out the inner part of the face frame, the cross piece, and I used those as spacers to put these pieces into place. And so that's going to give me a completely even square position of them, and I'm going to repeat that on the other side as well. And the nice thing with that is, with those ones, since I already have those cut out, I don't have to cut out extra ones and waste them, since my spacers will end up being part of the face frame. So I just kind of move that whole thing around and repeat the same process, putting in these ones using those same spacers. And once that's secured, then we can move everything around and actually put those spacers in where they need to be into the face frame. And this got a little long, so I had to get a little creative on how I was doing that. And at this point, my supervisor kind of let me go unchecked. The big boss happened to come by, so he got a little distracted in making sure she was happy and then left me alone to my own devices. But in the end, I decided that was just a good sign of trust that he was believing that I was going to get the job done properly, even without his direct supervision for a couple minutes. So after we put that aside, the next up on the list is making the drawers. And we're going to be doing shaker-style drawer faces for these as well. So I do have a video that shows how we make these, so I'll link that up in the top right if you're interested in a little bit more detail on that. And also, this router table is definitely paid for itself, and all the use that I've gotten it for the kitchen projects and for these as well. And we do have a good build video and plans of this router table if you're interested in that as well. And I'll link the plans in the description below. So after we use the router bit to get all the rails and stiles cut out. We're also doing these inner pieces, and I'm basically just cutting rabbet grooves all around the edges of this so it fits well into our pieces, and it'll sit flush against the drawers when we make them for installation. So time came for the glue up, and these are pretty darn long drawers, and I do usually clamp them up, but to be honest, you don't necessarily have to clamp these. If your fit is nice and tight, it'll probably hold just as well without it, but I always get nervous about it. So I had to use 2 sets of clamps just to get long enough because, like I said, these are longer than my 36-inch clamps. So I used that just in combination with another one right here you can see, and it still held it pretty well. But if you're getting a little squirrely like this, you do want to make sure that you're not causing any bending in the joints there. So you want to make sure it stays nice and flat still. So the next part, I want to plan for installation. And for the face frame, I'm essentially going to be just using pocket hole screws in strategic places to keep this in place, as well as a lot of glue. And so this is basically my drawer box. And I figure you're never going to see the inside of it. So I just put a whole bunch of pocket holes all around the edges of it. And you'll see that a little bit better once we do the next video and show you the installation. So when I wanted to make the top, my wall is super wonky. So my initial thought is what I was going to do is I was going to trace the curve of the wall onto pieces of plywood and use that as a template to make my top. So I did that, and then I used my jigsaw to cut it out. It'd be nicer like on a bandsaw or something like that, but I don't have one of those. I figured I could probably get it done, and man, was I wrong. Initially, I thought it was 50-50, user error, and just like a old terrible jigsaw, but I now actually have gotten a new jigsaw, and I think it's more like 90-10. This jigsaw was terrible. So I moved on to my backup plan, and that was just to get a whole bunch of scrap pieces and essentially just line them all up against the wall, and then I just use extra little other scrap pieces to connect them all, and I just did a ton of screws to make sure this thing was as rigid as possible and it wasn't going to move on me. And actually all of these pieces were part of the jigs that I used to make the top cutout in my router table, and I just kind of had them stored waiting for another use, and they definitely came in handy for this because I didn't have to waste extra wood to do this. So once I had that ready, I needed to get the top piece ready. So what I decided to do, I don't know if this is the best way or not, but it's what I did, is I just made a rabbet joint in the top piece because my plywood's only 8 foot long, but I needed 10 feet. So I just measured it precisely to see how thick it was, and then I set my router bit to do exactly half on a rabbet joint here. So then once I join them, they'll be perfect. And I actually did a test piece first just to make sure, because I didn't want to have a big old lip that I was going to have to sand like crazy to make it work. And the reason why I did that instead of just cutting like maybe like a 45-degree angle and then kind of joining them is because I knew I was going to have to move this thing a lot, and I figured this would just be a little bit more of a sturdy joint for me. And it worked out pretty well. So once I had that done, I just clamped it in place with the glue in there, and just so it wouldn't have a weird bow in there, I used just one of my long levelers just to kind of clamp it to there to keep it nice and straight while the glue dried up. And then it turned out pretty well. So once that was dry, then I took the template and I just clamped it all around the edge, and I used a flush trim bit just to kind of get that nice and shaped the way it needed to be to match the wall. And like I said, this is a really long piece, so I just did this in sections at a time because I wanted to make sure that the template wouldn't move on me. So I used a bunch of clamps and just kind of did the flush trim bit up until I got to one of the clamps, then moved them and then continued on all the way around it. Then I used this rasp just to do a little extra shaping to make sure there was no sharp points and everything went good against the wall. Next was a test fit, and then I took the opportunity just to mark out where the front would need to sit against the face frame, and I just drew a line there, and I just used my track saw guide here just to cut that out. And then we just took some good glue here, and we're going to be putting on a piece of trim on the front of that, and this will be all kind of sand down and painted over so it'll all look like one piece once it's done. And just to kind of help me hold it, I just loosely put on these clamps so this is kind of roughly in place. And then I just get my brad nailer and I line it up, of course making sure that it's just slightly proud of the rest of it, and you don't want it to be set down because otherwise it's going to create issues for you. So I just kind of get that in place and then throw a ton of brad nails in there, and then after it dries up, I put in some epoxy putty to fill in any little cracks there. And then once that was dry, then we moved on to the sanding. You can see the epoxy right there, and you can also see that I sanded into the plywood, but that doesn't matter because you're never going to see it once it gets painted. Everything will be nice and smooth. And then the last step before installation is getting the drawers made. And I'm doing this also with 3/4 inch plywood just because I had some extra, and I'm doing the bottoms with 1/2 inch plywood because they're really long drawers and I just wanted a little extra support down there. Just didn't want it to be too flimsy. And I also purposely waited until I was done with the cabinet boxes to do it, to make sure I had my measurements right and so it would fit properly. And we made this one just like we did with our prior drawers, and I have a video of my kitchen cabinet drawers that I made that kind of goes into this process with a little bit more detail. So I'll put a link up in the top right in case you're interested in seeing a much more in-depth explanation on how to get these made. But I wanted to make sure we put some edge banding up top just to make sure it looks nice. You can leave it with just the plywood layers exposed, but since it's interior, I prefer it just to be a little bit more polished. So all right, so now we got it made and constructed and it's ready to be installed. So next time we're gonna go over how we finish it and get everything in place. So we'll see you then.